So we will.
Let's go.
Let's do it. So for those of you who don't know, I'm Jay Boberg with Nicolas-Jay. And my two kind gentlemen that we have looking at you are...
I'm Jim Clendenen of Climat Winery, and Jean-Nicolas.
Nicolas of Nicolas-Jay and Nicolas-Jay.
And with the three of us are very pleased to welcome you all here to our webinar. This is one in a series that we've been initiating out of Nicolas-Jay and Mayo Camazet. And this is the first where we have had the fantastic joy of having a dear friend and a special guest to do a partnership with on this webinar. And having Jim be here is not only an honor, but also a treat. And I'm certainly will be a treat for all of you. Those of you that I'm sure we have many people that came from the, I believe from the Au Bon Climat mailing list and from the distribution of the information out there. And so you guys have probably met Jim, but any of you in the Nicolas-Jay family that have not had the pleasure of meeting Jim, your life will be forever changed by the end of this webinar. I can assure you. The format for this, I think you guys know, you can see the three of us. We unfortunately can't see you. This is a webinar, and to be able to handle the number of people, to have those little things on the screen, you guys would all be dots if we had all of you on the screen. So we have it set up in a webinar mode. There is a couple of ways that you guys can participate. One is that you have a chat room, and there's a chat thing which we have up and we can see in terms of you guys can talk among each other. And then there's also a question and answer tag down there where you guys can put in questions. And when Jean-Nicolas and Jim are answering questions or talking about their history and their winemaking, I'm going to do my best to read those questions and interject those into the conversation. So we want this to be interactive as best we can, and we hope that you will participate in that way. Before we move into the dialogue, I think, I know Jim and Jean-Nicolas and I all want to acknowledge what's going on out there in the world right now, not only the suffering and what's happening with the pandemic and what's going all around the world and still continues to this day, but it's also been a terrible time in at least certainly here in America with what's been going on as it relates to the unfortunate police activity and killing and so forth. And I personally want to send my condolences to their family and to everyone and encourage everyone who's out there speaking their mind and letting the world know that, and specifically our government know that we're not going to take this anymore and we can't put up with it. And I know Jim had
I'm just going to say very quickly, I'd intend to come in a mask because I wear a mask when I'm in groups. I wear it all the time. It's not a political statement. It's a me caring for the world kind of statement. And, you know, frankly, if much more of this shit goes on, I'm going to stop caring for the world. And then it won't matter all that much. But I have to tell you that I am metaphorically taking a knee right now out of solidarity with the idea of getting rid of systemic racism in our country. It's been very difficult to realize that there was open, hostile, horrifying racism until 1964. 1964 is to me like yesterday. I was very alive and very active during that period of time, and it's horrifying how little has changed, and it's horrifying from where it emanates. I watched something very special on the news yesterday talking about how people get over things. I'm not a religious man. Hard for me to accept religion as an excuse for any forgiving of people's behavior. But at the end of a presentation that was very moving to me, a black man said, "Hallelujah, anyhow." And that's the only way they can get over and get past all this. They can't write it off, they can't ignore it, they can't turn the other cheek, any of the bullshit that's been foisted upon them for the last 50 years. They still believe in their God, and they still believe with everything that's going on that they have to say hallelujah anyhow. And that was the most ironic thing I've heard in a long time, and it's a very ironic thing. So Nicola, you might want to chip in just a little bit because France has not been freed from the onus of prejudice and racism in your history either. And I've been not to as many protests and street marches in France as I have in the States, but France loves their protests and street marches.
Yeah, it's a national activity. It's a national activity. No, I think this is this what's going on, and the antagonism that is going on is very, very, very worrying. We had some echoes of the US situation here in France with demonstrations, because our police had a similar occurrences, and justice is still on this, so I cannot qualify this as murders, or but the problem is pervasive, and yes, we need people to bring us together and to really heal this, because the anger is mounting on every side of the society, and wins are not good, and I really don't like what I'm seeing from this terrible murder that happened in Minneapolis, and I don't necessarily like what I'm seeing as a reaction either. And protests are certainly very useful, but it's you see a lot of hatred also, and it brings back to the surface lots of bad sentiments, and I hope it goes away one way or the other.
Well, I don't think any of this is going to go away unless we change in terms of having respect for all human beings and treating all human beings equal. And that's really the essence, whether you're in France or you're in Russia or you're in America. It's really about everybody being human and realizing we all live together and need to respect each other. And that respect has to be both ways, always. And police are here to protect the people for which they serve. And it's not an easy job, and it's not a job that I would ever begin to want, but those that are honorable enough and gutsy enough to take it on, unfortunately have to understand that they at all times are there to protect and to serve. And this is the issue that is causing a lot of trouble. But at the risk of continuing, we could talk about this the whole time, and I know many of our viewers certainly have strong opinions about it as well. But it's a sad time, and hopefully it becomes a hopeful time, and that change can occur. So on that note, we're going to try to change and have an hour of some joy and some interesting education and some history here. We're going to talk about how these two fine gentlemen got started in the wine business, which Jim started in the late 70s and Jean-Nicolas in the late 80s. I apologize for the plane that's flying overhead. And I had the great pleasure of knowing both of them pretty much at the beginning. I got to meet Jean-Nicolas when he was at university, as some of you know, at Penn, doing his master's degree with my sister. And I met him in 1987 when I was at that time in the music business. And I met Jim in the early 80s, 84 or maybe 85, I can't remember, when I came up to visit him. And it was a typical Jim tasting. He said, sure, come on over. We were going to be there for 45 minutes. We got there at 2 in the afternoon, and I think we left at 10 p.m. But I don't remember, which is another part of going to a Jim Clendenen tasting. But that was sometime in the early 80s, and I can't remember the exact dates. And so you have before you two of the greatest winemakers on the planet, frankly, and neither of them are egotistical enough to say that, and they're both extremely humble, but I will say it, and it's true, and I've had the great joy of drinking their wines for a long time. But I thought, first of all, you guys should pull out the wines if you haven't already, and maybe you don't need our encouragement, but we're going to talk a little bit about the history, and then we'll dig into the wines. But I think we want you to go ahead and please pop them and start drinking them. And we're going to go in the order of the Chardonnays first, and then the Pinot. But you do whatever you want. This is really up to you. But Jim, I thought I would start with you since you started a little bit before Jean-Nicolas. But why don't you talk about? I know you started at Zaca Mesa in, I believe, 78 or 77. I'm not sure which. And why don't you tell a little bit about that beginning and what winemaking was like at that point?
Well, it was a real Wild West beginning. the man that taught me everything that I learned the first year that I was in the business. Ken Brown was a recent graduate from Fresno State. He'd done a couple of little training programs with various people, didn't have any more experience than that. I had no experience. He asked me 3 questions. First day that I went in to start working for him, and when I could not respond to any of the 3 positively or couldn't even understand the questions, what's a pH? What should a good acidity line of pH alcohol and TA be? And I looked at him, I said, I don't have any idea. He said, okay, good, you start tomorrow, I can teach you. Because I think that was the most important thing for him, to start with a blank slate and work on it. So I bottled the 1977s for Zaca Mesa, and we made 78, 79, and 80. And the longer I worked, the more I made up my own mind about what to do. So it was hard to keep me as an employee. I don't play well with children in the playground. That's kind of the way I am. I want to develop my own ideas and develop them pretty quickly. So I left from Zaca Mesa, went down to work in Australia, did 2 harvests in Australia, and then I completed the whole program by returning to France in '81 and becoming a disciple of Becky Wasserman's and working for the domain Duc de Magenta and also for Gerard Potel at Claude Laboustor. And during that period of time, I had a chance to borrow a Duchevaux camionnette from Becky and drive around and take notes on all of her suppliers, 40, 50 different producers, people like the Lafons and the Jobards, and one of the greats of all time, who's going to come up a lot in this discussion, I'm sure, is Henri Jaillet. And during that period of time when I was there, I was tasting his 78s and 79s out of barrel, and they were unimaginably good wines. I had tasted a couple wines before, and the funniest thing is I didn't get my appointment to visit Henri from Becky. I got my appointment because Henri had visited Zaca Mesa in 1979 with a busload full of Burgundians that came in. And I didn't know any of them, but the research I did made me think that Georges Chevalier, whose son became a good friend of mine, but great winemaker in Porton, and Henri Jaillet were geniuses. After knowing Henri for a 20-year span, after that period, I don't know who would disagree with me, or it wouldn't be politically correct, but Henri was the greatest red wine winemaker in the history of the world. And it's just that simple. Getting his tips philosophically. He visited me twice in California, which I really appreciated because I got a chance to get feedback directly. And Jean-Nicolas will be able to tell you, everybody has the idea that Henri had the twinkle in his eye and was the world's nicest guy. Henri was one tough son of a bitch. And what he felt, he shared with you. And if he didn't like what you did, he made you burn for it. And all along, when I went to visit him, I took my daughter Isabel, who's sitting here in the room. I'm going to turn it over to you in 1 second, Jean-Nicolas. But I took my daughter Isabel with me, and Marcel, Henri's wife, loved my daughter and loved to draw with her. And every drawing she did, my daughter, who was 5 years old when it started, and then got older progressively as I went over more often, every drawing she shared with Marcel bought me more drinking time with Henri.
That's great. That's a great story. That's a great story. So yes, well, I started in '89, and that was a family history because we were, my father, I had inherited the domain in 1959 from the Camuset family, and the Camuset had no direct inheritance. So this is how my the domain passed on to my father. And the domain was organized with tenants who worked the vines, the vineyards for the Camuset family, and then my father. One of the tenants was Henri, one of them, because you know what is funny, and we may talk about that later on. What is funny today is whenever people tell me, oh, you know, we've had a great male Camuset from the 70s and the 80s. Henri was a genius. Sometimes it turns out Henri did not make the wine because we had other people working for us. But Henri was one of the tenants, and he was certainly extremely gifted and talented. And so when it was decided that I would go and start at the Domaine, I was living in Paris, and of course knew Rhône-Romanée quite well. Spent some time with my grandparents here, but I was not a Burgundy kid yet, and I was not very knowledgeable on wine. So when I started over, Henri was just retiring, and my father had secured him as a consultant, which is a big word for, being my mentor or being my teacher. And that was naturally a very nice and great experience. But so I started in January '89. And we started with Christian Fauroy, who became my vineyard manager. And so we were both of us working Henri's vineyard. And as the season unfolded, the kind of pressure mounted on what kind of wines are we going to make, and in a new cuvée. We had reorganized my my parents' house in Rhône-Romanée, very tiny space. And how is it, he must share what he knows with us. And my father was very anxious. Will Henri share his secrets? And so come harvest, and we harvest, we vinify, and '89 was a very nice vintage, sunny, and et cetera. Things go relatively well, let's say, and then we taste the resulting wines, and I'm really pleased with them, and Henri is pleased. And as you say, with a twink of his eye, like he used, and his smile, he used to say, he turns to me and says, "Well, it's easy to make great wine."
Hey, Jean-Nicolas, what were the vineyards specifically that, because you had different holdings in Burgundy, but the family had them with different families, right? So Henri was farming particular vineyards, and then others were doing others. Can you sort of run down that? Because I think many people don't really know the details on that.
Yes, Henri was farming Richebourg, Brelay-Cros-Parentout, and Nuits-Merger. And Henri was hired by Etienne Camuset himself in 1945. He was obviously very young at the time. And but apparently Etienne Camuset was not shy about giving Henri the most precious vineyard, the Richebourg, and of course Cros-Parentout did not exist at the time. But so Henri had a relatively small share of our estate, but of course the Richebourg. And so the Clos Vougeot was to the Fauroy family. We had Christian was doing the Corton at the time, and we had also the Tardy family, Jean Tardy farming the Nuits Bouleau and the Vonchaume, and a small part of the Clos Vougeot.
Right.
And
was it the same métayage?
I mean,
was it the same métayage deal with the other families with Tardy, so that they would bottle half of it under the Mayo Camuset label and half of it would be under their own label?
Yeah,
it's
interesting because, talking about that and talking about that reaction that I have from some people, Henri is a genius. I tasted your Corton 85, and actually it's one very well-known taster in Paris on a tasting that said that to Christian. I tasted the Corton 85. It's a great wine. Henri was a genius. And Christian turned blank because he did the wine. He was the one doing the Corton at the time. But Henri is now so big that he's been doing. People think that he's been doing everything. So it's interesting in a way because there is a change of perspective with these wines. And I don't know if this happened to you, Jim, but when I was young, I thought I was much better than anybody else. And especially, I did not think I was better than Henri, of course, but especially in Burgundy at the turn of the 90s, there was a big change, a change of generation, a leap, so to say, with ambitious young people wanting to really do a great job, having traveled to the States. Maybe you were responsible for that change of mentality. And so very ambitious young people turn in that period, and people really wanting to make a bit more concentrated, riper wines, bigger wines. Burgundy was a bit green at the time. And so I was really in the mood of saying, well, what was done in the 70s and the 80s, really not great. But today, today what remains are the best wines of this era. But today, when I drink these wines, I say, well, they're quite good. We criticized our fathers, but these wines are quite drinkable and even great. So I don't know if it's a change, if it's old age being a bit more.
Not yet for you.
And or if it's terroir being standing out. But this is a tribute to what was done in the past, and we like to think that we've not invented everything, but that we've brought a lot of things. But great wine was made before us, unfortunately.
Every generation, whether it's winemaking, whether it's music, whatever it is, every young generation feels that the old guys and old gals don't really, they old, they were doing this stuff and we're gonna do it better. So you weren't alone in that. Jim, what was going on for you at that time? I mean, were you at Zacamesa? You were under Ken Brown, who became very well regarded. I mean, I think still to
financially, it was a nightmare. And so I learned a lot of things about what not to do financially. But it also was something that synthesized popular styles of wine like Chateau Saint Jean Chardonnay, non-malolactic, half fermented in tank, finished in barrel, controlled from top to bottom, processed very early. And the wines were tight and taut and really famous. And so when I come back and pull a Jean-Nicolas and I say, those wines sucked. They didn't budge. If you aged them 15 or 20 years, they didn't change. And there are a lot of famous Chardonnay makers, including a lot of famous Chardonnay makers that were in the Stephen Square Year tasting of 1976. And they made wines that were bulletproof, but they weren't textural. They weren't alive. They weren't harmonious. They weren't what I learned how to make when I went to Burgundy. And I've gotten into so much shit on the internet for saying this and naming names, which I'm not going to name names right now, but it's just unbelievable how people believe because something was the hallmark of the period of time that it was made in, then it was great, rather than it was only great because there was nothing that was a parallel of what they were making. And when we came back from Burgundy in 81, Adam and I started a Bon Climat right away in 82, and we started like we were a small Burgundian winer. Everything we had, 1 liter of French oak, all Francois Frere, 1 liter, like Henri, 1 liter of French oak for every liter of wine we made. Everything that we did was matured Surly. Everything we did wasn't filtered. We made wine as naturally while controlling oxidation as any wine that you can make. And that really grabbed a lot of people. I mean, our vineyards were pretty bad. Chardonnay was good, but the Pinot Noir was definitely pretty bad in 82, but people saw the style. They saw the direction we were going. The Pinot Noir was made 100% whole cluster. Henri told me if I ever used a single whole cluster, I was destroying my wine. He hated whole clusters. When I looked at him and said, but the greatest Pinot Noir I've had in my life, in 1962 La Tâche, the greatest, it was 100% whole cluster. And Henri looked at me and said, oh, Jim, if they would have destemmed, it would have been better. And there
Yes,
you sit. But we managed to evolve and do what we were doing in a very European kind of standard. And I will attribute that to one thing, my education in Akron, Ohio, where they began to teach me the French language when I was 8. And until I was 12, I was in private French classes with 3 or 4, a sprinkling of other kids. So when I went over in 81 to work, and I went over in 74 to visit and 77 to visit, but to actually work and learn in 81, I spoke French. And you can actually learn a lot from French people who don't speak English if you speak French. You can learn virtually nothing. I remember when André Chelichet, who didn't speak French, would take over busloads of young American winemakers there, and they'd come back and they'd have ideas that were ridiculous. You know, as if at the end of a red wine fermentation, when they took the must out of the open top fermenter and pressed it, they put it back into the open top fermenter, which is a simple recipe for completely oxidizing and ruining your wine. And of course, they never did that in France. They went into barrel. But if I could tell you how many times people ask me questions like, there's a growth on my wine here, we gas it every day, but there's a big growth, this white mung on there. Does it look that way in France? Well, no, it didn't.
So you and Adam started Au Bon Climat together, and that stayed. You guys stayed together, and at the time you were doing Chardonnay and Pinot. Were you doing Pinot Blanc? You were buying all the grapes at that point.
We did pink wine, and we did Pinot Noir, and we did Chardonnay. And then we started with Adam. I think the first and only vintage that Adam saw into the bottle was either the 88 or the 89, right before he left the company, of Pinot Blanc. But we got really excited about Pinot Blanc. I still am really excited about Pinot Blanc. Adam is probably the reason that we have a Bon Climat. My father was a corporate guy for Firestone Tire and Rubber Company, didn't understand starting a business, operating a business, didn't understand anything about entrepreneurial decision-making. And I was a little bit scared to start something on my own. I worked for Firestone Tire and Rubber Company for 2 years. When I quit, my dad said, your life is over. You got no chance, man. And within a couple of years, I had started a Bon Climat, and we were off to the races, doing really well. But Adam's father was a doctor. He had 5 siblings. All of them were the craziest, professions you can imagine. And they just started and did whatever they wanted. He was the one that thought we could start a company and make it work, and we did.
You certainly did. You absolutely did. And so, Jean-Nicolas, when it was 89 that you first went back, Henri was consulting with you. What vineyards were you working with then versus now? I mean, what have you added to the domains in that period of time?
So actually, what happened was that we decided to take over the name back, and but everybody were meant to carry on until their retirement. So Henri was the oldest of the tenants, and was the first one to go into retirement, and I took Henri's place. So we started with Richebourg, Brelay, Croparentou, Nuit-Murger. Christian joined me at that moment, so he brought the 2 vineyards that he were doing for us, the Corton Cloronnier and the Nuit Saint-Georges. And then progressively, as the others retired, we took over Von Romanet-les Chaumes, Clos Vougeot, and the last 2 vineyards that we added, that went back to the family, were Nuit Boudot and Von Chaume in 2008 from Jean Tardy. What I started at the very beginning is the plantation of Clos Saint-Philibert, which is a white wine that we do just above Von Romanet on the Haute Côte de Nuit section. And that was a big adventure still going on, with the planting of that vineyard, which is high on the slope, a very stony place, and the learning on how to make white wine, which was something that's still going on, and now going on in Oregon. So that was and still today I'm really I'm really very passionate about making Chardonnay. I think it's a great grape. I'm very adamant on what I like and dislike about Chardonnay, and not sure of what I'm doing with Chardonnay, but I'm trying. At least I'm trying. So
that's a good segue for us to start tasting some of these wines, and we can continue talking about some of the history and some of the changes. But why don't we start with the Jim? We wanted to start with the Affinité.
Yeah, I think that's the place to start. Younger.
And so, and then we can move on and taste the Alban Clément. So the Affinité is from 2018, and it's the very first Chardonnay that we've made from Nicolas-Jay. Jean-Nicolas, you want to talk about some of the winemaking and sourcing for the fruit and what we did?
Yes, it's coming from, it's a blend actually from our vineyard Bishop Creek. When we bought Bishop Creek, we found mostly some Noir, but there were a few blocks of Pinot Gris that we decided to graft over to Chardonnay. So that would be, we did a little bit of it in 2017, but this would be the really first effort, I would say, substantial effort. And we blend this with some purchase from elsewhere in the valley to make a blend that would represent Oregon Chardonnay. So it's really very exciting because I think Oregon Chardonnay is heavily influenced by Burgundy in mostly good ways, I hope. You know, I think that Oregon can turn out very, very, very decent and very nice Chardonnays, very balanced and fine Chardonnays. So we have with this 18 something that has ripened quite progressively. You know, nowadays I'm so anxious about harvesting Chardonnay right on the point, because it can, you know, turn and get overripe so quickly, and you know, warm and overripe Chardonnay is one of the most distasteful wines I know. So I absolutely want to avoid that in Oregon, and so far so good. I mean, we're quite pleased with the growing and the ripening of our vineyards in Chardonnay. So this is the first effort, Affinité, you know, trying to piece together a blend that goes well together, and we'll see how it evolves. But I'm very pleased with the first result.
Right. We made about 200 cases of this. This was, again, as Jean-Nic was saying, the first effort, and we're just releasing it. So the first baby steps. And the vineyard at Bishop Creek, we grafted over those 2 acres of Pinot Gris. So those were planted in '98. So those have the root structure and so forth that I think we have a lot of belief that those vines are going to really produce some wonderful fruit for us. We planted another couple acres that were planted at the same time, but those vines are going to take some time, obviously, to be able to come along. But there's someone that's been making Chardonnay in the New World for a long time, and this is the the 30th vintage of Chardonnay, something like that.
I'm pushing 40 vintages.
Pushing 40 vintages. So
being Zaccanesa in Australia.
You named this after your son, which is a fantastic.
No, the Chardonnay is the one that I made in defiance of
that's right.
Some of the American critical establishment. Anyway, I make lots of different kinds of Chardonnays. I know some of the fears, phobias, nervousness that Jean-Nicolas has with New World Chardonnay is that some of the wines are exaggerated in every kind of sense. And that has made some critics and some winemakers and some bloggers in particular paranoid of things like New Oak, paranoid of things like overripeness. You know, our Chardonnays don't get over 13.5 alcohol. Often they're 12.8. In our expensive wine, as in Burgundy, we use lots of new oak. The wine you have in front of you is 100% new Francois Frere from a beautiful forest that we get that's not too far from where the dearly departed Didier Dagueneau used to live in the Loire Valley. And Didier turned me on to the wood, Bertrange, and I've been using that ever since. I've been using it for about 20 years. When we air dry the wood for 3 years, we make barrels that I think are the best in the world. I've said this many times before, and I know that Jean-Nicolas won't contradict me because I know what barrels he has in his cellar also. But if you can imagine,
in France,
every wine made in Henri's career, Henri Jaillet's career, was a Francois Frere new oak barrel. That didn't matter if he was making a Bourgogne or if he was making a Richebourg. He gave it the best wood that was possible, and because of that, he made the best wine that he can make. I remember when I first started working in Oregon, the first vintages I worked were 84, 85, 98, 99, 92, 93, 4, 5. And the only thing that separated my wines from everything else that was going on in Oregon during that period of time is I used a lot of new Francois Frere. And all the Oregonians were criticizing me. And now if you drink our wines, they're so tight, taut, complex, and wonderful from really bad vintages like 95, 96, 97. You can find 3 worst vintages in a row in any grape growing area in the world. Phone up and I'll compare them with you. Hard years to make good wine, but the barrels were tremendously important to us. And so you're looking at a wine here that is from 45-year-old vines at Biennacido, and there aren't that many places anymore in the US that have 45-year-old vines, because the older your vineyard, the likelihood that it was planted by somebody who had no idea what they were doing is very probable. And so you have to replant it. I've replanted every Pinot Noir vineyard that I work with, but this Chardonnay was good enough in the right row orientation, the material that it was growing, that we left it alone. So half of it is 45-year-old vines, which I'm really proud to be working with, though there aren't that many old vineyards that I'd like to work with. And the other half is my new vineyard, where I had this famous French educator wandering around with Jean-Francois in my vineyard, looking at the soil and looking at everything, told me the rootstocks I should plant and the clones I should choose. Professor Raymond Barnard from the University of Dijon, who invented all of the Dijon clones. And he told me what to plant for a Portugais, for a rootstock, and he told me what that I should plant as clones. So I planted that in 1998 at my property in right across the river from Biennacido, and it's called Le Bon Climat. And as Dominique Lafont told me at one point, you know, Jim, when you say Au Bon Climat, we admire you. We're all looking for a really good vineyard. When you say Le Bon Climat, fuck you. Because that means the good climate. So, and I said, thanks, Dominique. I'll take that advice. But anyway, the combination of the two, over 2 years in barrel, all of it new, racked out of new wood at the end of its first year, Surly, and into neutral barrel to let the wine grow and surround the wood, is a style we've made for this wine since the early 90s. And it's been a style that's really served us well. And what I love now is you get to people that are talking about fads, they're talking about funny things that winemakers are doing, and they'll look at me and they'll get a wine like this, as lavish and exuberant in its expression of new wood, filling your mouth, filling the aromatics, filling out the wine in a really big way, and they'll go, no new oak, right? And you know, you don't really know what new oak tastes like, do you? But you know you hate it.
But Jim, as lavish as it is, and as you say, as sort of rich as it is, what is great about this wine is that it has balance. You know, the acidity it really holds it there, and it's not dominated. I think, listen, the use of oak and having new oak and having these, and whether even if it's ripeness to a certain degree, the challenge is to be able to get a wine that has balance, and you've done that with this. And that's what I think, and that's also why this wine's going to last a long time, is because of that balance in terms of that. What is the yields that you get from those 45-year-old vines?
45-year-old vines average between 2.5 and 3.5 tons, exactly where you'd want it to be. Some years when I look at it, I'm thinking about dropping some crop in the ground, but then I look and see how vigorous the vines are. They're old, they're established, they're not setting more fruit than they can ripen. So I don't like to drop fruit in the ground and then leave very vigorous vines racing through the ripeness of a smaller crop. So we tend to let nature control things until things are totally out of hand, both ways. but I have a half ton per acre in 1995 in Pinot Noir at Vienna-Cito Vineyards. I can't paste it back on from the year that it had a little bit too much. So if I get 4.2 tons, I'm likely to keep it, trying to balance things out over time. And, you know, it's great to be religious. A lot of people are very, very disciplined when they look at their vineyard. And I like to think that a lot of people throw the profit of their vines on the ground in a year like 2005, really big, lavish year all over the world, like 90, the same kind of thing. And people that are dropping fruit in the ground instead of vinifying every cluster they can get may have some moralistic fervor behind their actions, but it's certainly not professional or successful.
And how much of this wine do you make, Jim?
I make about 1,000 cases. This one, 1,006.
About 1,000 six packs.
And out of all the Chardonnays I make 10 Chardonnays. And out of all the Chardonnays I make, this is the one that I push for the idea without having a system that allows us to call something a Grand Cru. If you walk into a great white winemaker in Burgundy cellar, you've got Bourgogne, you've got Village wine, you've got Premier Cru, you've got Grand Cru, and the Grand Cru is where they concentrate their best, their ripest fruit, and the best kind of winemaking techniques they can use. But the hysterical thing is you never, ever, 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 ever saw any great white winemaker in Burgundy say, these grapes can get the ripest, so I'm going to pick it at 14 or 14.5 alcohol. That wasn't the solution. The solution was the most concentrated, the most rich, the most thick and textural white wine you could have, and then put it in the best cooperage you can age it in, and be patient. A really good thing, now that I've been making wine for 38 years in my own company, I don't have to be bottling at the end of 7 months for my Chardonnay, which I did the first 3 years I was in business. I bottled the rosé after 4 months. I had to sell the rosé to buy bottles so I could bottle the Chardonnay.
It's called cash flow. It's called cash flow. It's being an entrepreneur. We understand. We understand completely. So, and when do you bottle this now? So this is the 16. This went into the bottle in...
This went into the bottle in sort of early part of fall, right before the grapes came in 18.
In 18.
And I have other ones that I keep 3 years in barrel, depending on the vintage. And I do that because I heard all these years about René Lafont and his team leaving wine in barrel for 3 years, and Dominique decided to start bottling it after 18 months or 2 years. And so whenever I hear that kind of stuff, it sticks in the back of my head, and I want to try it out. So I make Nebbiolo that's aged 5 to 6 years in barrel, because everybody in Italy talked about the good old days in Italy when they did that too. So I'm not making my money off of that. You know, these small projects are things that are supported by 40,000 cases of inexpensive Santa Barbara County Pinot Noir and Chardonnay that sells really well. So.
Got to pay the bills to be able to, you know, it's all about being able to take chances, and you got to have things that pay the bills so that you can then take chances on doing the other things that really give you the growth and the interest and excitement of doing something new. It was the same.
Especially during the pandemic.
Yeah.
I spent all my career learning and working and understanding chefs. I love to cook. I hang with them. I don't hang with other winemakers very often unless I'm in Europe and traveling and visiting my friends. And they're all my friends. They're all my supporters. And until this week, they've all been closed for the last 2 months. And I have to tell you, you don't want to be looking at my books right now. The red stuff has gone off the page.
Yeah, well, I mean, listen, only good news about the pandemic is we've all been drinking a lot of wine out of our cellars and so forth.
Hear, hear.
There is a question, Jim, what proportion of new and neutral oak is Jim using for the Chard? You answered that question. It's 100%.
Yeah, 100% new oak for this Chardonnay. But if someone bought one of the 12,000 cases of Santa Barbara County Chardonnay that we have widely available by the glass in restaurants and all over the country, that would have 0% new oak.
Yeah, no, understood. Well, let's move on to the red wines. Jean-Nicolas, do you want to start out talking about the Pinot Noir, the 2015 Nicolas-Jay Willamette Valley?
Yes, we have here the Willamette Valley 15. Very interesting vintage in Oregon. Very concentrated. What was very interesting, we started the same day in Burgundy and Oregon. Harvest started on the 3rd of September.
Really?
Which was very early for Oregon. The season was quite warm in Oregon, but the last 2 weeks were relatively cool. So we avoided cooked grapes and and overripe grapes. So these 15s have really some a lot of grip. They are generous, but they are nonetheless quite firm. And this is a wine that really evolves very slowly, progressively, and is a wine which is still very promising, because I think it can further develop and further, climb and reach a climax, which we hope for in a few years. But that was very interesting and very lots of experience on this 15, because this is really the vintage where I saw that yes, Chardonnay, yes, Oregon in general might be a little bit warmer, or make some wine which show a little bit more sweetness than in Burgundy, but we can have also great balance, and we can strike great balance and reveal a lot of structure in these wines. So that was a very our second vintage, but a very great experience.
And I think the thing about the 15 for us is Jean-Nicolas said, was our second vintage. And the first vintage, 2014, was one of the hottest summers that Oregon had experienced. We, in our first vintage, we had 7 days that were over 100 degrees, which is not completely out of the norm, certainly in Northern California. I don't know how much of that you really get, Jim, but
you don't get much.
Yeah, not much. But in Oregon, they never got it. And so I think Jean-Nicolas and I, in hindsight, felt we might have picked 1 or 2 vineyards in 14 a little later than we would have optimally. But it was our first year working with the vineyards. And for those of you that don't know, we have 8 vineyards that go into this Willamette Valley. The Bishop Creek that Jean-Nicolas spoke about before is our estate vineyard, where we have the Chardonnay, where we grafted over the Pinot Gris. But it's also the primary source of our Pinot Noir. About 35% of the grapes that are in the bottle that you're drinking now come from Bishop Creek. And that's an older vineyard in the scheme of things. It was planted in 87 and 88. And most of those vines, the Pinot Noir vines, are on their own roots, meaning they're ungrafted. So as Jim was talking about the joy and respect of working with an older vineyard, we are very, very fortunate to have been able to purchase that in that vineyard at the beginning, right at the very beginning of 2014. But back to 2015, I think 15 was a reaction in terms of our picking strategy to 2014, in the sense that it was again hot. It was actually technically hotter than 2014. 2015 was, in terms of the heat measures. But we were seeing this development. We were getting these samples, and Tracy and I were getting these samples, and we're seeing this development, but no development in the numbers. And I will never forget that we were having our daily call with Jean-Nicolas, and he was looking at the numbers, and we were talking about what they were tasting, and he kept saying, well, are you tasting development? I said, yes. And how do they taste? And it was like, well, they're just getting better and better. They seem to be great. He says, well, when are you going to make the decision to pick? And we went, oh, okay. Well, I think maybe now, because if you wait too long, you're going to, all of a sudden the numbers are going to jump up, and then you're going to wish that you picked before. And we said, yeah, okay, you're right about that. And there we go. And we just said, okay, well then we're picking. And we picked the 2015, and we ended up with a wine that is 13.02% alcohol.
Yeah.
Which you were very happy with, Jean-Nicolas, and a wine that unfortunately at the very beginning was a little tough to pour for people when we first released it, because it was really tight and really not showing the sort of depth and so forth that it has. We were double decanting that wine every time before we would go out and pour it to restaurateurs and to various different people. But it may be one of my favorite vintages, if not my favorite vintages that we've done. And as you said, John Nicola, now there's no need to double decant. The wine really is starting to come into its own. And I think 5 years from now, it'll be even better, even better. What do you think?
I really like the freshness and the fruit that is developing out of this wine, and the precision in texture in the taste, in the mouth.
It's really showing well today, I have to tell you, and showing classically Jean Nicolas style of wine. Beautiful, rich fruit, moving towards blue and black rather than red and cranberry, and then has that firmness in the finish that comes from, for me, your style of handling. And I'm still drinking lots of 2000s that should be warm and fully evolved from the domain, and they still have just a little firmness in the finish, keeping them completely alive, very dark in color, totally delicious. And that's back when I could afford to buy Burgundy, so it was a good period of time. I've got two really quick things to say.
That goes for all of us, Jim.
From a business point of view, I want to, if you're on the air with us, Loie, I want to thank Loie Bonacorsi for working really hard to get her wine in Chicago with all of the street protests and everything that was going on there. There was nothing being delivered by any of the delivery services, and Loie comes. She's a matriarch of a really famous wine family in Chicago, and one of my dear friends. So when I heard she got her wine this morning, I was really happy. I also want to say that I love the 14. When I tasted your 14, when we were down in Los Angeles together, and I was making some presentation, and you were tasting with a wine buyer at Republique, I think it was.
Yes.
And you were double decanting that too, because it's a great way to show wine when it's young. I think it's a really smart thing. I think it's really, really, really the best way to proceed. This wine persuades me a little bit more. We had the same situation in Santa Barbara, that we had really hot 14s and 15s. We actually picked 15 before 14, but the difference was 3.5 tons per acre in 14 and 1.5 tons per acre in 15. And so the grapes, just with that warmth, ripened really, really fast. What I've said many times, and so why not say it again today, because it has nothing to do with Oregon or Santa Barbara. We had a very, 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 very hot year in 14. Our nighttime temperatures didn't drop into the low 50s. Our nighttime temperatures dropped into the low 60s. I said it was so warm for us. It was so warm for us. It was almost as warm as Sonoma.
There you
You're
go.
tasting a wine here that's totally from the Santa Maria Valley, named after my 20-year-old son who's studying in Japan. We used to do everything we possibly could, Joe Nicola, to make the most extremely difficult conditions to make wine. Now I'm convinced I'd rather make decisions that allow me to make wine better and make it easier. But we planted, if you can imagine, Biennacido, one of the coldest vineyards in California, we planted a north-facing slope at 1,200 meters, and we planted it to a bunch of really slow ripening clones, some Dijon. And we began to make wine with it from young vines, and it was very complicated. And even now, the yields are so horrible. In a year like 2011, my grapes cost me $25,000 a ton. I got less than 1/4 of a ton per acre, and I had grape contracts at $11,000 an acre. And I didn't even get a I'm sorry card from the grower, but I don't want to say that. They're really, there we are. Mostly
What are
Biennacido.
the clones, Jim?
The clones of Biennacido are the Swan clone from Sonoma, 667, my favorite clone in the world, and I would only plant that now if I was planting a high quality site. 777, 115, which I also love. And then I have a really weird one that was brought over by Augustin Erasli in 1900 when he brought over the clones that they kind of filled the Davis library for clones that they're going to keep. And we call it the Murphy's clone because it was a place that was planted 100 years ago and nobody cared about the place site for anything, so they never tore it up. It's a horrible clone. It's the worst thing that I've ever planted. So if you really want to plant that clone, and you're that brave, then I hope you put it on your epitaph.
So we have a question about clones, actually, and maybe you can both address this. They're asking how important is clonal selection, and then they want to know what are the clones in this Pinot. So Jim, you just answered that in terms of this Pinot.
Let me touch on it really quickly, because I learned a lot in France. Jean-Nicolas can certainly tell you. And one of the most important things is they developed all these great clones from Dijon and offered them in France. And every French winemaker that I know worth his salt said, we don't need no stinking clones. And they took the things that are in their vineyard, they propagated them as selection massal, and then they brought their own plants up again and they replanted it because they wanted to have what they had was special. We didn't have that benefit in California. We had a lot of stuff that was badly planted from in different clones with horrifying density, 500 vines per acre. In Burgundy, they have 4,000. And that's a big difference in the competition with the roots and the competition for the size of the vines are going to be there. And, we were basically growing small palm trees with a bunch of saggy grapes beneath them. And now we've improved on that quite a bit in the last 20 years, no question about it. But what I really think, you asked me when I made my first good Pinot Noir in my life, 1987, from Sanford and Benedict Vineyard, they had 3 different clones. And all 3 of those clones, and they were the worst, Gamay Beaujolais, vertical growing Pinot Noir. We called it Gamay Beaujolais, and I mean, it was just garbage. And then we had one that was taken from Mount Eden that was really wonderful. And then we had the old UC Davis Pomard Martini 4, whatever it was. And they were all better than anything any other vineyard in the area was planted. So if you got a great site, you can diminish parts of it with average clones, enhance parts of it with great clones, but you've got great material to work with. If you've got a bad site, then you better use the best clones you possibly can, do the best farming you possibly can, and hope something is going to come out.
Even then, it's probably not going to be great.
It's not, but now we have had a chance, we've had experience to be able to go through and see vineyards that I planted that are now over 20 years old, which is not very old, but it's still better than if I kept the crap that was in the ground before we grafted them and planted them. And we have these plants showing same terroir, same soil, same exposure, and wines in the same block 10 times better than other clones that are less competitive. Very interesting.
Jean-Nicolas, you want to talk about the clones in the Oregon Pinot? And
yes, it's always good to have a combination of clones and try to recreate what we have here in Burgundy. That is this kind of really blend of plants that give a variety and also enable the wine to be a bit more diverse. So yes, it's clonal selection was necessary, especially with Chardonnay. Chardonnay was really sick, very sick in the 60s, and clonal selection was really meant to save the grape, literally. And to this date, I think that clonal selection with Chardonnay is more is of better quality than Pinot Noir. Pinot Noir is we've started we've taken another course in Burgundy to try to select a group, not have a clone per se, but select a group of plants that look a little bit the same and that will be planted together, 4 or 5 clones, so to speak, that would be planted together rather than have a single plant, because this has proven to be difficult and a bit disappointing, not reacting exactly the way you wanted it to react. And Pinot Noir is so fickle, it's you think it's going to be predictable. You plant that clone, and in the site, in another site, doesn't react exactly the way you wanted to. You thought it would react. So I think in a way, and it's the Burgundy philosophy, but in a way you're better off and you're safer with having a bunch of clones planted together. And but this is still not the method in America, and I can certainly understand why. I mean, you have a number of things that some characters that about the various clones. So the idea is more to plant separate blocks. But I would like at some point to introduce this idea of of having a blend of clone in the vineyard rather than separate blocks. I think that could be an idea worth trying in Oregon.
Right. Well, we'll be able to do that because, as you know, Jim, we finally got up the guts to buy a piece of property where we're refurbishing a barn. So we're going to start making wine in our own spot rather than renting a space in other people's spots, even though our hosts at Sokol Blosser and Adelsheim over the past 6 years have been fantastic hosts.
Those are good hosts, yeah.
Those are great hosts. They were fantastic, but we're going to be able to have our own spot. But with that, we've got a beautiful 52-acre property that we've got about 25 acres of Jory soil that we're going to be able to plant. So Jean-Nicolas is going to get his opportunity to do that kind of planning and make those selections. But I do think it's interesting on the clonal fact that the clonal side of things, that 777 is a clone that you talked, Jean-Nicolas, about being one that you just couldn't stand, and it was flabby, and it was this and that and the other. And then
I hate it. I hate it in Burgundy.
Exactly.
Yes.
And I hate it in Santa Barbara, but I don't hate it as bad as other ones.
Okay, because I hate it in Burgundy, but the in Burgundy is a very important addition to that statement.
Oh, no, Oregon, that single-handedly changed, along with getting rid of the Davis clone, Clone 3 and Clone 4 of Chardonnay, single-handedly changed the quality of Chardonnay, and the 777 clone single-handedly changed the baseline for Oregon, the baseline.
Right.
And that baseline, you can build a whole orchestra around, and so you can do what you're talking about, which I'm very interested in, having different clones in the same block. But there's so many things you can plant and work with. But all of a sudden, when 777 came in, rookie winemakers with 5-year-old vines were making wines that were pretty damn near the top of the game,
Yeah, well, the 777 at Bishop Creek is definitely block 4, which is what it is some of our favorite wines. I mean, that block occasionally will be the favorite wine in that vineyard. So it's interesting how they can be. So we're over our time here, but I did want to give each of you an opportunity to ask one more question. As it relates to the wine business, I mean, you've talked about winemaking and so forth, and how that has evolved. But sitting here in 2020, and let's leave the pandemic out of it for the moment, but sitting here in 2020 versus say 1990, because at 1990 you were both in the wine business, you were selling wine around the world, and I think, Jim, you are actually one of the few, not that few, but certainly one of the most international sellers of wine of anybody coming out of California. What is the difference today in terms of selling wine versus what was going on in 1990?
1990 was a great year. So selling not 1990 the calendar year, but 1990 the vintage year, taking it out. It's always wonderful to go out with a vintage declared fantastic worldwide, because it gives us all a chance to get our feet in the door with various things. And so that was a whole different time. Where, right now, and I'm not going to talk about the pandemic, but the circumstances surrounding it. Closed restaurants, the idea of trying to keep them healthy and safe when things are opened up by diluting the amount of people you can have inside. The complications are extraordinary. I've talked to some of the most intelligent restaurateurs, from Emerald Lagasse and Frank Stitt down in Birmingham, Michael Wild, who ran a restaurant up in Berkeley, great wine program for 40 years, and they are completely befuddled about what's going to happen.
Yeah,
we have large wine lists, expensive bottles of wine, glamorous food, white tablecloths. Is that going to be there again? And so when you hear that, it's kind of scary. My business is predicated on selling to restaurants, and there you are, and a little bit difficult. But I look around, I'm convinced it's all going to hell. And I'm looking around and I'm counting boxes, and they're still going out. You know what happens when you really can't sell to a single restaurant in Santa Barbara, San Francisco, Los Angeles, or New York? You get a phone call out of the blue and a 2,000 case order for Chardonnay and Pinot Noir to go to the Systembolaget in Sweden. And everything I read about Sweden is they may not have made the right choices for what they did to fight the COVID problem, but somehow they're motivated enough to buy wine so they can sell it so people can drink, you know. As it gets worse in the UK, when the going gets tough, the Brits drink more. When the going gets better, they drink even more. And, you know, these are the reasons that I export, because they've been so much better for me than a lot of my customary markets in the US. But I'm not optimistic. I'll let John Nicola take up his part of it, though. I'm not optimistic about where things are going, because there has never been this much uncertainty in what people are going to want to do with their leisure time.
No, I think that's what's maybe what has changed is that there are many more good wines compared to 90, and also many more good wine drinkers and connoisseurs worldwide. So that's great, because I think the overall knowledge is going up, and the overall production of great wine is going up too. And I think it's great what has happened in 30 years in terms of wine drinking and production is really great. So what we hear is that, and what we certainly experience ourselves, is our consumption is not going down. So I remain optimistic for the near future, and yes, I'm still a little bit worried with our friends from the restaurant business, and we're trying and we'll try to find some ways to help them, and hopefully they will rebound. But in every place that has been freed from this lockdown, you know, people are going back to restaurants and they want to enjoy. So I really hope that this is going to go on, and that business will be back up, because we sure need our restaurants to this wine is never better than with food. It's a complete experience. And so we absolutely need that. Yes.
So my take on this, and I was not making wine in 1990 like the two of you were, but I was certainly consuming it, and consuming both of your wines that you guys were both making. But the big differences to me between then and now is that two things. One is what you made reference to, Jean-Nicolas, is I think the caliber of wine drinkers around the world. People have more education, people have more knowledge. I think they have more appreciation. I believe that in 1990, the number of people who would consider going out to a restaurant and picking out a special bottle of wine, or having a bottle of wine and having that be their entertainment for the evening, was a relatively small group. Nowadays, it is very widespread that the entertainment, the evening's event, is going out to dinner and having wine, or having folks over to your house and cooking a meal and having wine. And I think that people's participation in that is just much more widespread around the world, and there's more appreciation for fine wine, and that is sort of channeled both with access to information over the internet, and also the ability to get close and get more knowledge and build relationships with the people like the two of you, and, you know, with Nicolas-Jay, with Mayo Camazet, with Au Bon Climat. You know, it was not, we would come visit you, Jim, up at Au Bon Climat. And certainly that's something that happened. But I think nowadays the number of people that are planning trips, and again, this is before when everybody was able to fly, and hopefully that'll come back. The number of people around the world who are planning trips simply to go to wine regions, to go visit wineries, I think is much greater today than it was in say in 1990. And I do have faith that the restaurants are going to come back. I think that it's going to be different. I think that even doing this today, having this virtual tasting, having several hundred people be with us in an intimate thing, getting to hear you guys tell stories and know that, it was much harder to execute this. The technology and the pandemic in a certain way is accelerating the closeness of relationship. We're building much more relationships directly between our customers and the people that are appreciating what you're doing at Climat, what we're doing at Nicolas-Jay and Nicolas-Jay. And I think that overall is building that bond that will hopefully carry through this and get us through this pandemic. But it's going to be different. There's no doubt it's going to be different. And I think that this is sort of a challenge to find out what we're made of. And at the end of the day, we love wine, we love food, we love what we're doing, and that passion is contagious. And we have to just come up with new ways of connecting with people and getting that emotional connection and having them really connect with what it is that we're doing and appreciating that. So on that note, thank you to everybody for participating. I believe that we appreciate those of you that were able to get the wines and taste along with us. We really appreciate that. I think we're certainly going to send something out to you so that all the wines that you tasted today, you'll get an opportunity to be able to buy direct from the two wineries. And I know, Jim, you guys are hosting people. Are you hosting people now? Are you open or?
We're not, but our tasting room is going to open in the next week down in Santa Barbara.
Great.
You won't have to buy a burrito from a taco truck. You can actually just come in and taste the wine and then move on down the line.
Great. So please reach out to Climat, and we hope to see you guys out in Santa Barbara. And we are now starting to take appointments at our tasting house in Dundee, which is where Jean-Nicolas and I live when we're in Dundee. But we just started just this week, started booking by appointment only to do tastings there. And then in September,
We're the same.
Our new facility will open up in the Dundee Hills, and we hope to host all of you up there. So thanks so much for attending, and thank you, Jim. Jean-Nicolas and I thank you a lot for joining us to have this little discussion. It's been great.
Great seeing you in great shape.
Yeah, some better shape than sometimes, huh? I'm thinking that the next time we do this, we do 3 hours.
Okay, I don't know if our audience can put up with that, but certainly it would be fun. All right, you guys, thanks so much.
Great.
Have a good weekend, everybody.
All the best. Thanks to the audience. Thank you for tuning in.
Yes, stay healthy.
Thank you.